Don't just stand there breathing my air. Coffee boy, go find something useful to do outside this room. Open this door before I suffocate! And I will be your wife! Do something, anything!
In the cold, humming heart of Vance Defense, power isn't measured in money, but in access. Victoria Vance, the youngest CEO in the history of the military-industrial complex, moves through the server farm like a queen, unaware that her kingdom is built on sand. To her, Leo Spark is nothing more than a ghost in a polo shirt, a low-level cybersecurity intern whose only contribution is knowing how many sugars she takes in her morning latte. But beneath the surface of the high-tech server farm, a silent mutiny is brewing. Rivals within her own board have turned her greatest weapon, her automated security system, into a tomb. As the heavy titanium doors of the server vault hiss shut and the oxygen pumps begin to reverse, the hierarchy of the corporate world is about to be incinerated. In the face of death, social status dissolves into nothingness. When the world turns dark and the air grows thin, Victoria will find that her life depends on the one man she never bothered to see. This is a story of how lightning can mend a broken heart, and how the ultimate sacrifice can rewrite a man's worth.
The morning sun hit the glass towers of Vance Defense, but inside the sub-level server farm, it was always a cold, artificial twilight. Leo Spark moved through the corridors with the practiced silence of a man who had learned that his presence was a nuisance to the powerful. In his hands, he balanced a tray of expensive lattes, the steam rising to meet his face as he approached the grand boardroom. He was a cybersecurity intern with a master's degree from MIT, yet his most vital contribution to the company was ensuring the CEO's drink was exactly 145 degrees. He didn't mind the work, but the way they looked through him, as if he were part of the furniture, stung more than any verbal insult ever could. Inside the boardroom, Victoria Vance was a vision of sharp edges and cold brilliance, her navy blue suit tailored to perfection. She was mid-sentence, tearing down a quarterly report, when Leo entered to set the drinks down. Without breaking her stride or even glancing at his face, she nudged her empty cup toward him, nearly splashing her silk sleeve. "You're late with the caffeine, Spark," she snapped, her voice like cracking ice. The board members chuckled, a low, syrupy sound of collective mockery. Leo offered a polite nod, his eyes lingering for a second on the security terminal behind her, noticing a strange flicker in the encryption logs that no one else seemed to see. "I noticed a slight anomaly in the Level 4 firewall protocols this morning, Miss Vance," Leo said softly, trying to find a footing in his actual field of expertise. The room went silent for a heartbeat before Victoria let out a sharp, mocking exhale that felt like a slap. She finally looked at him, but there was no recognition in her eyes, only a deep, simmering disdain for his audacity to speak. "The coffee boy thinks he's an engineer now," she said, turning back to her directors as they erupted into fresh laughter. "Go back to the break room and wait for the next order, Leo. Try to stay within your very limited pay grade."
Leo retreated. The heavy oak doors muffled the sounds of their laughter, but the weight of the humiliation stayed in his chest. He headed down to the server farm, the rhythmic humming of the cooling fans acting as the only solace for his bruised ego. He sat at his small, cramped workstation, tucked away between towering racks of humming processors. While the rest of the company prepared for the lunch rush, Leo stared at his screen, his fingers dancing over the keys as he tracked the anomaly he had tried to warn Victoria about. It wasn't just a flicker, it was a ghost in the machine, a systematic shutdown of the manual overrides.
Suddenly, the lights in the server farm flickered and died, replaced by the eerie, rotating crimson of the emergency strobes. A heavy, metallic thud echoed through the floorboards, the sound of the primary magnetic locks engaging across the entire facility. Leo checked his terminal, but his access had been revoked, his screen displaying a mocking "access denied" in bold red letters. He looked toward the central vault, a high-tech fortress of glass and titanium where Victoria had gone to check a secure data drive. The door wasn't just closed, it was sealed, and the digital display above it showed a terrifying countdown for the emergency oxygen purge. Inside the glass-walled vault, Victoria's composure shattered the moment she realized the door wouldn't budge. She pressed her palms against the reinforced glass, her eyes wide as she saw the ventilation fans grind to a halt. Outside, the boardroom members were nowhere to be found, having used their private exit before the lockdown fully engaged. She was alone, trapped in a soundproof tomb that was designed to protect data by suffocating fires, and now it was suffocating her. She pounded on the glass, her designer watch clinking against the surface, but the only person left in the sublevel was the man she had just ridiculed. Leo ran to the vault, his breath coming in short gasps as he saw her panicked face through the thick glass. He tried the keypad, but it hissed with static. The wires had been fried by a remote surge. Victoria's movements were becoming sluggish as the CO2 levels began to rise, the air thinning in the small pressurized space. She sank to her knees, looking up at him with a mixture of terror and a dawning, horrific realization. This wasn't a glitch, it was a corporate execution, and the only person standing between her and a silent death was the invisible intern she had treated with utter contempt. "Can you hear me?" Leo shouted, though he knew the glass was nearly impenetrable. Victoria's lips moved, her voice a faint rasp as she pressed her forehead against the cool surface, looking at him with desperate, pleading eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear that leveled the playing field between them. Leo looked at the control panel, then at his own trembling hands, knowing that the system was rigged to stay shut until she was gone. He looked back at her, seeing her clawing at her throat, and he knew he couldn't just be the coffee boy anymore. Would his hands be enough to break a lock designed by gods of industry? The silence of the sublevel was replaced by the aggressive, rhythmic thumping of Victoria's heart against her ribs. Inside the vault, the air felt thick and metallic, every breath requiring a conscious, agonizing effort. She watched through the glass as Leo sprinted to a secondary maintenance terminal, his fingers flying across a keyboard that looked ancient compared to her executive tech. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him as a servant, but as a lifeline. She saw the sweat pooling on his forehead and the way his jaw set in a hard, determined line, a side of the coffee boy that was invisible in the boardroom. Leo's screen was a chaotic waterfall of red error messages and scrolling kernel panics. The conspirators hadn't just locked the door, they had rewritten the facility's DNA, creating a digital loop that rejected every standard override. "Come on, talk to me," Leo hissed at the monitor, his voice cracking with the pressure. He could see Victoria in his peripheral vision, her elegant navy suit now a prison cell, as she leaned her back against the glass, sliding slowly toward the floor. The environmental sensors on his screen showed oxygen levels at 14. A speaker crackled to life, but it wasn't a rescue team. It was the distorted voice of Marcus Sterling, the head of operations who had been sitting to Victoria's right only 20 minutes ago. "Give it up, Spark," the voice echoed through the server farm, cold and detached. "The system is on a physical air-gapped timer now. In 10 minutes, the accident will be complete, and a new Vance defense will rise without its temperamental queen." Leo didn't look up, his hands moving even faster. The betrayal was absolute, confirming that the entire security infrastructure had been weaponized against its own creator. Victoria heard the voice through the internal intercom and let out a choked, bitter laugh that turned into a coughing fit. She looked at the camera lens in the corner of the vault, her eyes burning with a mix of fury and heartbreak. She had built this company with a ruthless hand, believing that efficiency was the only virtue, only to be discarded by the very men she had promoted. She turned her gaze back to Leo, who was now ripping open a floor panel to expose a chaotic nest of fiber optic cables. He was the only one who hadn't been bought, perhaps because he was the only one she had deemed too insignificant to matter. "Leo," she mouthed against the glass, her vision starting to blur at the edges. She watched him pull a multi-tool from his belt and start stripping wires with a desperate ferocity. The environmental pressure was beginning to drop, causing a painful popping in her ears. Outside, Leo was fighting a war on two fronts: the digital ghost of Sterling's virus and the physical reality of the reinforced titanium bolts. Every time he bypassed a logic gate, the system countered with a fresh encryption layer, moving the goalposts further back as the clock ticked down. The heat in the server room was rising, as the cooling fans for the processors were diverted to hide the power surge of the lockdown. Leo's shirt was soaked through, the gray fabric clinging to his back, as he bypassed the third security relay. He looked up at Victoria, seeing her head loll to the side, her consciousness flickering like a dying candle. He slammed his fist against the terminal in frustration. The software was too deep, too sophisticated to be cracked by a keyboard alone. He needed a physical bridge, something to trick the solenoid into thinking the open command was coming from the master CPU. Environmental pressure alarms began to blare, a high-pitched shearing sound that signaled the final stage of the purge. Leo looked at the high-voltage power rail running alongside the door's frame, and then at the fried control board. He knew the theory. If he could jump the 440-volt circuit directly into the lock's actuator, he could force the magnets to repel. But the gap was too wide for a simple wire, and the surge would be catastrophic. He looked at Victoria, who was now slumped on the floor, her hands still pressed weakly against the glass in a silent, dying plea for help. Leo stood up, his breath hitching as he realized the math of the situation. There were no tools left in the room that could handle that kind of current to live. The arrogance of the corporate world had created this death trap, but Victoria's world had narrowed to the sound of her own shallow, rasping breath. The edges of her vision were fraying into a dull gray, a sign that her brain was starving for the very thing she had always taken for granted. Through the thick, soundproof glass, she saw Leo pacing like a caged animal, his eyes scanning the room for a solution that didn't exist in a manual. She felt a profound, stabbing guilt. She had spent months making this man feel like a ghost, and now, as her empire turned into her tomb, he was the only soul in the world fighting for her. Outside, the servers hummed with a mindless, mechanical indifference, their cooling lights blinking like thousands of unfeeling eyes. Leo felt the crushing weight of the environmental pressure building in the room, the air around him thickening with the heat of overworked processors. He knew the conspirators were likely watching through a hidden feed, enjoying the spectacle of their clean takeover. Every second he spent typing was a second Victoria lost to the darkness. Her movements inside the vault now nothing more than weak, spasmodic twitches of her fingers against the floor. The internal intercom crackled again, Victoria's voice coming through as a ghostly, labored whisper that broke Leo's heart. "Leo, stop. They've won," she gasped, her face pressed against the cold metal of the door's interior frame. "Save yourself. Get out before the halon gas triggers." She wasn't commanding him as a boss anymore. She was pleading with him as a human being who didn't want to witness another death. Even in her final moments, the realization that she had wasted her life on people like Sterling while stepping on people like Leo was a more bitter pill than the lack of air. Leo ignored her plea, his hands trembling as he gripped a heavy-duty copper grounding cable he had ripped from a backup generator. He looked at the high-voltage bus bar, the golden vein of power that fed the entire sublevel, and then at the recessed port of the door's emergency solenoid. The gap was nearly a foot wide, and the jumper cables he had found were scorched and useless from the initial sabotage. He was an expert in logic, in the clean and orderly world of code, but the situation had devolved into something raw, physical, and terrifyingly simple. Inside the vault, the first hiss of the halon gas began, a sound like a nesting cobra.
Victoria's eyes flew open, a final surge of adrenaline hitting her system as the white mist began to curl around her ankles. She knew this was the end. The gas would displace whatever oxygen was left to prevent any fire from damaging the servers. She looked at Leo, her expression one of utter, heartbreaking resignation, and she saw him drop the useless cables. He stood before the high-voltage rail, his face illuminated by the red strobe lights, looking like a man about to step into a furnace.
"I won't let you die in there, Victoria," Leo screamed, though the sound barely reached her through the insulation. He could see her fading, her head falling back against the wall, her eyes losing their focus. The social hierarchy that had defined their relationship for months had been incinerated by the emergency lights. He wasn't the intern, and she wasn't the CEO. They were just two people in a basement, one of whom was about to commit an act of unthinkable violence against his own body to save the other. Leo's mind raced through the electrical resistance of human tissue, calculating the odds of his heart stopping the moment he made the connection. He knew that if he acted as the bridge, the current would override the digital lock, but it would also use his nervous system as a fuse. He looked at his hands, the hands that loved to play piano and type complex algorithms, and realized they might never be the same again. But then he looked at Victoria's pale face through the glass, her life slipping away in a cloud of white gas, and the choice became effortless. With a final, jagged breath, Leo reached out toward the pulsing gold of the power rail. He saw Victoria's eyes drift shut. Her body slumped completely now, a fallen queen in a kingdom of silicon and wire. The humming of the servers rose to a deafening roar in his ears, a mechanical scream that seemed to mock his humanity. He didn't care about the company, the promotion, or the invisible status anymore. He only cared about the girl behind the glass who was about to disappear forever into the dark. Could a human heart withstand the power of a city? The halon gas inside the vault reached Victoria's waist, a thick, white shroud signaling the final countdown. Leo's fingers hovered inches from the live bus bar, the static electricity in the air making the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. He could feel the raw power humming behind the metal, a lethal current waiting to be unleashed. He looked at Victoria one last time. Her chest was barely moving, her skin turning a haunting shade of porcelain blue. The woman who had once commanded global markets was now a fragile flame flickering out in a cold, airless box, and the sight of her helplessness shattered the last of his hesitation. "Open this door before I suffocate, and I will be your wife. Do something, anything." Victoria's voice suddenly erupted over the intercom, a final, desperate burst of primal survival. It wasn't a romantic proposal. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated terror from a woman who had realized her money and status were useless against the void. She clawed at the glass, her eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at Leo with a frantic, pleading intensity. The weight of her words hung in the electrified air, a vow born of extremity that transformed the cold server room into a theater of life and death. Leo didn't answer with words. He answered with action. He gripped the heavy copper lead connected to the door's solenoid in his left hand and prepared his right hand to bridge the gap to the high-voltage rail. He knew the risk. The current would travel across his chest, potentially stopping his heart or frying his motor nerves instantly. But as the white gas rose to Victoria's neck, the math of his life became simple. Her survival was worth more than his safety. He braced his feet against the rubber matting, grit his teeth until they ached, and slammed his bare palm onto the pulsing gold bus bar. The world exploded into a blinding white light as the circuit was completed through Leo's own flesh. A guttural, agonized scream tore from his throat, but it was quickly drowned out by the violent, mechanical crackle of the electricity. His muscles locked instantly in a tetanic seizure, his body arching with the force of 440 volts coursing through his nervous system. He couldn't let go. The current held him in a lethal embrace, turning his arms into glowing conduits of pure energy.
Through the haze of searing pain, he saw the sparks flying from the door's solenoid as the physical lock finally began to yield. Victoria watched in horrific, slow-motion clarity as the coffee boy turned himself into a human fuse. She saw the blue arcs of lightning dancing across his skin and the smoke beginning to rise from his clenched fists. The smell of ozone and burning fabric filled the air outside the glass, a scent she would never forget. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not just from the lack of air, but from the sheer, terrifying magnitude of his sacrifice. She had spent years watching men step on each other to climb the corporate ladder, but she had never seen a man destroy himself to pull someone else up. The magnetic locks on the door let out a final booming clack as the surge forced the heavy bolts to retract. With the last of his conscious strength, Leo threw his weight backward, the momentum finally breaking the electrical grip that held him to the rail. He collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, his hands charred and smoking, his body twitching with residual shocks. The vault door hissed and swung open an inch, just enough for the pressurized halon gas to begin pouring out into the main room, equalizing the atmosphere. Victoria scrambled toward the opening, her lungs burning as she sucked in the tainted but oxygen-rich air of the server farm. She fell through the door, gasping and sobbing, her hands shaking as she crawled across the cold tile toward the motionless form of her savior. The arrogance that had been her armor for years had completely disintegrated, leaving behind only a raw, shattered gratitude. She reached out to touch Leo's shoulder, her fingers trembling as she saw the state of his hands. The fingers that had just bridged a gap of certain death were now curled and blackened.
Leo? Leo, look at me, Victoria cried, pulling his head into her lap, ignoring the soot and the smell of singed hair. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with agony. But as they landed on her face, a small, weak smile touched his lips. He tried to move his fingers to touch her cheek, but they remained frozen in a claw-like grip, the nerves irreparably damaged by the surge. In that moment, surrounded by the humming machines and the dying red strobes, the CEO of Vance Defense realized that the man she had treated as invisible was the only true light in her world. Would his sacrifice be the end of his dreams, or the beginning of a new empire?
The sterile white lights of the Vance Defense Executive Wing had never felt so warm. 6 months had passed since the night the server farm became a tomb, and the company had been purged of every traitor who had stood by while Victoria suffocated. Marcus Sterling and his co-conspirators were behind bars, but the scars of that night remained visible in the way Leo Spark held his pen. He sat in the sun-drained office that used to belong to Benend, who mocked him, his hands encased in specialized compression gloves. The surge had saved Victoria's life, but it had stolen the fine motor skills required to ever type a line of code or play a piano again, leaving his fingers stiff and prone to tremors. Victoria stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city she still commanded, but her posture had changed. The cold, impenetrable shell of the Ice Queen had been replaced by a quiet, fierce protective streak that centered entirely on the man sitting at the mahogany desk. She turned as she heard the soft clatter of a pen dropping. Leo's hands had failed him again. In the past, she would have rolled her eyes at such incompetence. Now she crossed the room in 3 strides, her silk dress rustling, and knelt by his side to retrieve it. She didn't just hand it back. She held his hand in hers, massaging the scarred tissue with a tenderness that stunned the staff who watched through the glass.
"The board is waiting, Leo," she whispered, her voice soft but carrying a weight of absolute authority. Leo looked down at his hands, a shadow of frustration crossing his youthful face as he struggled to adjust his grip. "I'm an engineer who can't use a keyboard, Victoria. I'm a cybersecurity expert who can't even bypass a simple smartphone lock anymore," he said, his voice tinged with the bitterness of a man who had traded his passion for a life. He felt the phantom hum of the 440-volt rail every time he closed his eyes, a reminder that his sacrifice had been permanent. He had saved the queen, but he had lost his own kingdom of logic and precision.
Victoria stood up and pulled him to his feet, her eyes burning with a fire that brooked no argument. You didn't just save a CEO that night. You saved the soul of this company, she said, her hands resting firmly on his shoulders. If you can't type the code, you will dictate the vision. You aren't my intern, and you aren't my subordinate. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a velvet box, placing it on the desk between them. Inside was a heavy gold signet ring and a legal document that would change the corporate landscape forever. It was a partnership agreement, naming him co-CEO and Chief Visionary Officer of Vance Spark Defense.
The boardroom swung open, the same heavy oak doors that had once muffled the laughter of his bullies. As Leo walked in at Victoria's side, the room didn't erupt in mockery. It fell into a silence of profound respect. The new board members, vetted for their integrity, stood up as one. Victoria led Leo to the head of the table, pulling out the chair directly next to hers. She didn't need to speak to assert his value. The way she looked at him told the world everything they needed to know. The Invisible Man was now the most important person in the building, his dignity restored, not by his hands, but by his heart.
After the meeting, the two of them walked through the server farm, the place where everything had changed. The smell of ozone was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh air and expensive floor wax. Victoria stopped in front of the vault, which had been decommissioned and turned into a glass-walled memorial for the company's new direction. She turned to Leo, the red strobe lights of the past replaced by the soft, golden glow of the evening sun. "I made a promise in that box, Leo," she said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "I told you that if you opened that door, I would be your wife. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." Leo looked at her, seeing the woman who had once treated him like a ghost, now looking at him as if he were the sun and the stars. "You were dying, Victoria. You don't owe me your life because of a desperate vow," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out with his trembling hand, and she caught it, interlacing her fingers with his, pressing the scarred skin against her cheek. "I'm not doing this because I owe you," she countered, a tear finally escaping and tracking through her perfect makeup. "I'm doing this because I can't imagine a world where I have to breathe without you. You gave your hands for me. Let me be your hands for the rest of our lives." The transition was complete. The coffee boy and the ice queen stood together in the heart of their high-tech empire, a testament to the fact that even in a world of cold silicon and heartless algorithms, humanity was the ultimate override. Leo Spark had lost the ability to manipulate the digital world, but he had gained a partner who would protect his dignity until her last breath. As they walked out of the server farm hand in hand, the machines continued to hum, but the song was different now. It was the sound of a new era. Would the world be ready for a company run by a man who knew the true cost of power?